3:58 a.m. Baltic Sea. A winter storm system that had been building over the Gulf of Finland for 36 hours reached Gotland at 3:58 a.m. with sustained winds of 41 knots and visibility reduced to under 600 meters in heavy snow. The conditions had been forecast accurately for 2 days. Every maritime operator in the northern Baltic had seen the forecast. Most had used it as cover. The Polar Star was a 22,400-ton ro-ro cargo vessel registered under the flag of the Marshall Islands, operating under a charter to a Latvian logistics company that had held the contract for Baltic commercial cargo runs since 2019. Its AIS transponder showed it on a standard course from Helsinki to Klaipėda, consistent with a regular weekly sailing that the vessel had completed 14 times in the preceding 8 months. The vessel's registered captain held a Lithuanian maritime license. Its crew of 26 included nationals from 8 countries. Every document associated with the Polar Star's current voyage had passed through the automated screening systems of 4 separate port state control authorities in the preceding 6 weeks without generating a flag. At 3:58:11 a.m., as the storm was reducing visibility to 580 meters north of Gotland's midpoint, the Polar Star deviated from its logged course by 12 degrees to the northeast and reduced speed from 14.2 knots to 8.7 knots. Neither change was unusual in a storm system. Both changes, taken together with the vessel's current position, directly above the Gotland Basin Fiber Cable's northern segment, which connected Estonian and Latvian military communications with the NATO fiber backbone at Gotland's eastern shore, registered an alert at 3:59:09 a.m. on the NATO Cable Protection Intelligence database that had been established 18 months earlier following the incidents in the Baltic. The alert threshold had been set at a combination of 3 factors: vessel AIS deviation, speed reduction, and proximity to a mapped cable asset below a defined depth contour. The Polar Star had triggered all 3 simultaneously. The alert reached the Swedish Navy's Maritime Operations Center at Borga at 3:59:22 a.m., 13 seconds after the database generated it. The Maritime Operations Center's duty officer examined the contact alongside the vessel's AIS history and made a rapid assessment. The course deviation was within the range of storm maneuvering. The speed reduction was consistent with heavy weather, and the cable proximity was the triggering variable. He classified the alert as a Category 2, requiring active monitoring and assessment but not yet warranting immediate interdiction. He activated the CABLEGUARD protocol that notified Swedish, Estonian, and Latvian naval authorities simultaneously and placed the NATO Cable Protection Response Network on elevated watch. At 4:02 a.m., 4 minutes after first alert, the Polar Star deployed a remotely operated vehicle over its stern. The ROV deployment was visible on the Finnish border guard's maritime surveillance radar at Hanko, which was tracking the vessel as part of routine storm traffic monitoring. The Finnish radar operator had seen ROV deployments from research vessels before. This one was different in 2 respects. The vessel was not a designated research vessel, and the deployment was occurring in conditions: 41-knot winds, 600-meter visibility, 3.4-meter wave heights, in which no legitimate commercial operator would launch a subsea vehicle for any non-emergency purpose. The Finnish radar operator transmitted his observation to the Swedish Maritime Operations Center at 4:03 a.m., 1 minute after the ROV entered the water. The Swedish duty officer's Category 2 alert was immediately upgraded to Category 1. The CABLEGUARD protocol's Category 1 response sequence activated at 4:03:44 a.m. Immediate notification to the Baltic Air Policing Detachment at Šiauliai Air Base in Lithuania, the Swedish Navy's alert submarine at Berga, and the NATO Maritime Command at Northwood. The CABLEGUARD protocol's Category 1 cascade activated 6 separate notification streams simultaneously. The Baltic Air Policing Detachment, the Swedish submarine, the Swedish surface vessel, NATO Maritime Command, the Finnish border guard, and, most immediately relevant, the pre-positioned CABLEGUARD asset. The cascade was designed so that all 6 notifications were transmitted in parallel rather than sequentially. The sequential notification architecture of older emergency response protocols had been identified in the September exercise as producing a 4 to 7 minute delay between the triggering event and the furthest downstream recipient. The parallel architecture reduced that delay to under 3 seconds for all 6 recipients simultaneously. 3 seconds was the difference between the Gotland Patrol One receiving its activation at 4:03:44 a.m. and receiving it at 4:07 to 4:10 a.m. In a race measured against an ROV descending at 30 to 40 meters per minute toward a cable at 247 meters, 4 to 7 minutes was not a marginal difference. It was the difference between interposing before cable contact and arriving after. The response geometry was the problem. The storm system that had been selected as operational cover was doing its job. The Baltic air policing P-8A at HSwMS needed 34 minutes to reach the polar star's position. More than enough time for an ROV operating at the Gotland Basin's 250-meter depth to complete a cable severance. The Swedish alert submarine at Berga needed 51 minutes at maximum speed. The closest Swedish surface vessel with the sensor capability to track an ROV at depth, HSwMS Gotland, a Göteborg-class corvette, was 67 nautical miles away and would need 68 minutes at flank speed in the current sea conditions. None of these assets would arrive in time to prevent a cable severance if the ROV had already been targeting the cable. The cable alert's operational innovation, the element that distinguished the response from the failed response architectures that had preceded it in the 2021 and 2022 incidents, was its pre-positioning protocol. Following an exercise conducted in September of the current year that had specifically modeled the storm cover cable interdiction scenario, the Swedish Navy had established a rotating 72-hour pre-positioning cycle for a CABLEGUARD designated asset at Gotland's southern maritime approach. The asset was not a submarine. It was a Svan-class coastal patrol vessel modified with a lightweight sonar system and a small ROV of its own, designed specifically for cable protection response. The modification had been completed 7 months earlier under a classified Baltic Maritime Security Enhancement Program, funded jointly by Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, and Finland. The vessel, HSwMS Gotland Patrol One, operating under a deliberately generic designation that did not appear in publicly available naval order of battle documents, had been at its pre-positioned station since 4 a.m. the previous day. At 4:04:02 a.m., 1 minute and 18 seconds after the Finnish radar's ROV observation reached Berga, HSwMS Gotland Patrol One received its CABLEGUARD Category 1 activation. Its position was 11.4 nautical miles southwest of the polar star. At 22 knots in the current sea conditions, arrival at the polar star's position, 31 minutes. The race was not the same race as Svalbard, or the Bab el-Mandeb, or any of the preceding scenarios where the operational question was whether defensive assets could arrive before a kinetic event completed. The race in the Gotland Basin at 4:04 a.m. was more precise. Could HSwMS Gotland Patrol One's own ROV reach the cable before the Polar Star's ROV could complete a severance given the Polar Star's ROV's 4-minute head start? The Gotland Basin's cable depth at the target position was 247 meters. An ROV descending at standard survey speed covers approximately 30 to 40 meters per minute. The Polar Star's ROV had entered the water at 4:02 a.m. At the standard survey descent rate, it would reach cable depth at approximately 4:08 to 4:10 a.m. HSwMS Gotland Patrol One would not arrive at the surface position until 4:35 a.m. Its own ROV could not be deployed until the vessel arrived. A A surface-launched ROV could not reach 247 meters depth from 11 nautical miles away in time to matter. The Gotland Patrol One's commanding officer understood this arithmetic in the 20 seconds between receiving the activation and beginning his sprint transit. His vessel's own ROV was not the relevant asset. His vessel's lightweight sonar was. The Gotland Patrol One's towed array sonar could be deployed at speed. It was designed to operate while the vessel was underway, unlike the hull-mounted systems on larger ships. If he could reach a position within the sonar's effective detection range of the Polar Star's ROV before the ROV completed its work, he could generate the acoustic track that would allow the legal documentation of what was occurring below, feed position data to the P-8A when it arrived, and establish the evidentiary record that the Baltic cable incident response protocol required before any physical intervention could be legally justified. The towed array deployed at 4:06 a.m. as HSwMS Gotland Patrol One accelerated to maximum speed through the storm. The array was operational at 4:09 a.m. The Polar Star's ROV was assessed by the sonar return at 4:11 a.m. The acoustic signature of its thruster was consistent with an ROV at approximately 190 meters depth, still descending 2.4 kilometers from the cable's charted position. The sonar track was transmitted in real time to the Swedish Maritime Operations Center, to the P-8A now airborne and 23 minutes away, and to the NATO Maritime Command. The storm conditions that had been selected as operational cover for the Polar Star's operation were simultaneously the factor that made the Gotland Patrol One's approach less detectable and the factor that complicated the Polar Star's ROV operation at depth. An ROV operating at 247 meters in the Gotland Basin during a surface storm experienced the effects of storm-generated turbulence as attenuated but non-zero current fluctuations at depth. Typically 0.2 to 0.4 knots of variable current at 200 to 250 meters in the conditions that prevailed at 4:02 a.m. The variable current required the ROV's positioning thrusters to work harder and generate more acoustic noise than calm water operations, which had contributed to the strength of the sonar return that HSwMS Gotland Patrol One had acquired at 4:11 a.m. The storm cover was imperfect. Every operational condition has second-order effects that planners account for imperfectly. The Polar Star's planners had selected storm cover for its effects on surface detection. They had not fully accounted for its effects on subsurface acoustic signature. At 4:14 a.m., the Swedish Maritime Operations Center transmitted a formal communication to the Polar Star on the International Maritime Distress Frequency. The communication identified HSwMS Gotland Patrol One as a vessel of the Swedish Navy, stated that the Swedish Navy had confirmed an ROV deployed from the Polar Star in the vicinity of a critical NATO communications cable, and directed the Polar Star's master to immediately recover the ROV. The communication invoked Sweden's rights as a coastal state under UNCLOS and the Baltic Cable Protection Agreement of 2024, which had been signed by all 9 Baltic Sea NATO member states, and which authorized coastal state naval vessels to require the recovery of any subsea vehicle operating within 5 nautical miles of a designated cable protection zone. The Polar Star did not respond on any frequency. The P-8A arrived overhead at 4:37 a.m. The Polar Star's ROV had been in the water for 35 minutes. Its acoustic track on HSwMS Gotland Patrol One's sonar had shown it reaching cable depth, 247 meters, at 4:16 a.m., and moving toward the cable's charted position at approximately 1.4 meters per second. At that speed, it had reached the cable's position at approximately 4:30 a.m. For the past 7 minutes, the ROV had been at cable depth in the charted cable corridor. Whether it had made contact and whether it had conducted any cutting operation was not yet detectable by sonar alone. The P-8A's contribution was not additional sonar coverage. It was surface coverage of the Polar Star itself, and the deployment of an acoustic communications buoy that allowed direct data link to the Swedish submarine HSwMS Södermanland, which had been at maximum speed since the Category 1 activation and was now 22 minutes from the position. The Södermanland was the asset that could reach cable depth, confirm the cable's integrity, and physically interpose between the Polar Star's ROV and the cable if the cable had not yet been fully severed. At 4:44 a.m., the Polar Star's AIS showed the vessel beginning a turn to the northwest. Recovery mode. The ROV was being recalled, whether because the cable severance had been completed because the approaching HSwMS Gotland Patrol One was close enough to be a deterrent factor, or because the operation's timeline had expired, the Polar Star was ending its operation. HSwMS Södermanland reached cable depth at 4:49 a.m. and conducted a direct visual inspection of the cable using its own ROV. The inspection's result was transmitted to the Maritime Operations Center at 4:52 a.m. The cable's outer sheath showed evidence of cutting tool contact along a 40-centimeter section, scoring and partial penetration of the first protective layer. The fiber optic bundles within the cable were intact. The cable was operational. The cut had not been completed. At 4:54 a.m., HSwMS Gotland Patrol One arrived at the Polar Star's surface position. The Polar Star had recovered its ROV and was proceeding on a northwesterly course at 11 knots. The Swedish Navy's vessel transmitted a boarding request under the Baltic Cable Protection Agreement's Inspection Authority. The Polar Star's master, now responding on the maritime distress frequency for the first time in 50 minutes, stated that the vessel had conducted emergency anchor chain inspection during the storm and had deployed a small underwater inspection camera that had now been recovered. He denied any ROV operation in the cable protection zone. The sonar track that HSwMS Gotland Patrol One's towed array had maintained from 4:11 a.m. to 4:44 a.m. was already in the classified evidence archive. The cable's 40-centimeter scoring was documented in HSwMS Södermanland's visual record. The Finnish radar's observation of the ROV deployment in storm conditions was logged in the Hanko Border Guard Station's time-stamped recording system. The Polar Star's denial was noted and filed. It was inconsistent with the evidence and consistent with every previous denial in every previous Baltic cable incident. The Baltic Cable Protection Agreement's Inspection Authority allowed boarding of a flagged vessel when there was documented evidence of cable interference. The Swedish Navy boarding team transferred to the Polar Star at 5:17 a.m. The vessel's ROV storage compartment, when accessed by the boarding team under the boarding authority, contained an ROV whose manipulator arm was configured with cutting tooling consistent with the scoring found on the cable. The tool's cutting edges showed material consistent with the cable's outer sheath protective layer. The Baltic Cable Protection Agreement, under which the boarding had been authorized, was 11 months old. It had been negotiated in a focused 3-month process that followed a November incident in which a different vessel had conducted an ROV operation over a different cable in the Gulf of Finland without any legal mechanism being available for boarding and inspection. The November incident had not produced a prosecution. It had produced a treaty. The 11-month-old treaty was being used for the first time on this particular morning, its first operational deployment in the 11 months since its entry into force. The boarding authority it provided when tested against the evidence that HSwMS Södermanland's ROV inspection had documented, and the sonar track that HSwMS Gotland Patrol One had recorded, had produced a boarding that none of the boarding personnel had any doubt was legally grounded. The doubt was in the prosecution pathway. The Polar Star's flag state was the Marshall Islands, whose maritime registry was administered by a private company in Reston, Virginia, under a delegated authority arrangement. The flag state's cooperation in any criminal proceedings would depend on a legal process that crossed 3 sovereignties. The 26 detained crew members were nationals of 8 countries. The legal architecture for prosecuting a maritime infrastructure sabotage attempt involving 8 nationalities, a Marshall Islands flag, and an ROV operation in Swedish territorial waters was not simpler than the technical operation it had disrupted. The Polar Star was directed to Visby Harbor under Swedish naval escort. Its crew of 26 was detained pending investigation. Its ROV and all associated equipment were placed under forensic preservation order. The Polar Star's crew manifest cross-referenced against the maritime intelligence databases that Swedish and Finnish authorities maintained on vessels associated with previous Baltic cable incidents, produced a match within 72 hours of the boarding. 2 crew members whose names appeared in a classified intelligence assessment as personnel associated with a network linked to state-sponsored maritime infrastructure operations. The match was at the level of probable association, not confirmed identity, because the matching records used name variants. Probable association was sufficient for an extended detention. It was not sufficient for a prosecution. The legal architecture that the Baltic Cable Protection Agreement provided was solid for the boarding and the vessel detention. The prosecution would take considerably longer to build than the 1 hour and 13 minutes of the operational response had required. Time from AIS deviation alert to CABLEGUARD Category 1. Activation, 5 minutes 44 seconds. Time from Category 1 activation to HSwMS Gotland Patrol. 1 underway at maximum speed, 18 seconds. HSwMS Gotland Patrol One arrival at Polar Star position, 31 minutes. P-8A arrival overhead, 37 minutes. HSwMS Södermanland cable depth inspection, 47 minutes after Category 1. Cable integrity maintained. Fiber optic bundles intact. Evidence of cutting tool contact, confirmed 40 centimeters. Polar Star ROV in water, 42 minutes. ROV recovered before cable severance, confirmed. Boarding completed, 1 hour 13 minutes after Category 1 activation. Vessel directed to port, Visby. Crew detained, 26. Forensic evidence preserved ROV with cutting tooling, sonar track record, Finnish radar log, cable scoring documentation. The forensic analysis of the Polar Star's voyage data recorder conducted by Swedish maritime investigators at Visby Harbor over the following 48 hours produced the picture of the operations planning that the cable scoring and the ROV's tooling had only partially revealed. The vessel had made the same ro-ro cargo run between Helsinki and Klaipeda 14 times in the preceding 8 months. On 12 of those transits, it had passed through the Gotland Basin's northern approaches within 8 to 15 kilometers of the cable's charted position. The deviation toward the cable position on this transit had been the 14th time the vessel had passed through the area, and the only time it had deviated. The 12 preceding transits were in the voyage data record, their courses logged, their speeds logged, their times logged. They had been preparation runs. Route familiarization transits conducted on a legitimate commercial schedule that provided operational cover for 12 transits worth of direct observational data on the Gotland Basin's traffic patterns. The cable protection surveillance architecture's activity levels, and the optimal storm window for an ROV operation. 14 transits to conduct one operation, 12 to prepare, 1 to demonstrate something had gone wrong, the previous Baltic cable incident that had generated the September exercise, and 1 to execute. The patience of the planning was the most unsettling element of what the voyage data recorder revealed. The pre-positioned CABLEGUARD asset was the variable that had changed the outcome. Without HSwMS Gotland Patrol One's pre-positioned station, the nearest asset would have been HMS Gable at 68 minutes. The cable at 247 meters depth in a 42-minute ROV operation would have been severed before any responding asset arrived. The 72-hour pre-positioning rotation that had placed the Gotland Patrol One at its station had been approved in September, funded in October, and operational in November. The Polar Star's operation had been conducted in December. The timing was not comfortable, It was sufficient. The storm that had been selected as operational cover had provided the operational environment that the Gotland Patrol One's towed array sonar had needed to operate effectively. The storm's ambient noise signature had masked the Gotland Patrol One's own acoustic signature during its sprint transit, allowing the vessel to close to sonar detection range without the Polar Star's crew detecting its approach and recovering the ROV early. The operational cover had been used against the operation it was designed to enable.